Section 6 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 5. Alliances against France. Death of Henry, 1497 to 1509. To trace Henry's connections with the French wars in Italy, and his reason for joining the Italian League against Charles VIII in 1496, it is necessary to go back to events 2 years earlier. Charles had carried out in August 1494 the attempt on Italy of which his ambassadors had spoken in England, not heeding either the dissuasions of his wise sister or the dying advice of Louis XI to give France at least 5 or 6 years of rest. He had in his mind a collection of the strangest and most confused motives and purposes that can be conceived. The strongest feeling of all was the vanity which made him wish to stand forth as a youthful Caesar or Charlemagne at the head of a France which the late annexations had made stronger than it had been for centuries. Besides this, he had a fitful belief that he was divinely ordained to break the power of the Turks. But his notions of the way to accomplish this were as indirect as those of his predecessor Saint Louis, who landed at Tunis in order to conquer Jerusalem. First, Naples must be subdued, then the whole of Italy. After this, it would be easy to become king of Greece and to organize the whole for the conquest of the Holy City. As to the first step, he might claim Naples as being a titular position of René of Anjou, who had ceded his dominions to Louis XI. Indeed, René had been nominally king of Jerusalem as well, so that his claim too had been conveyed by the same cession. It is hardly possible to imagine a more irrational mode of opposing the victorious Turks, for Charles's plans were sure to shatter rather than consolidate the means of resistance by setting one Italian state against another. Besides this, it was necessary before he started to bribe other princes not to attack his own dominions during his absence, and for this purpose he surrendered to Maximilian Artois and Franche-Comté, and to Ferdinand Roussillon and the Cerdagne. Of these districts the first 2 had been given up to Louis XI in 1481, and their retrocession now laid France open on the north east. The latter were the keys of Catalonia, also pledged to Louis in exchange for his support at a critical juncture, and their recovery was now regarded by the Spaniards as hardly less important than the conquest of Granada. Yet, after all, Maximilian was not conciliated, for he knew that Charles hoped to make himself a kind of Eastern emperor, and therefore his rival. Nor yet Ferdinand, who was sure to take the first opportunity for supporting the Aragonese dynasty of Naples, which Charles intended to dethrone. In Italy itself, the only ally of France was Ludovico Sforza, who had usurped Milan from his nephew Giovanni Galeazzo Sforza, and in order to retain it, was delighted to throw all Italy into confusion by a French invasion. Only the briefest summary of the French operations can be given here. Charles at once alienated Ludovico Sforza by supporting his nephew in a fit of romantic generosity, and lost the hope of Florentine friendship by insisting on entering the city as a conqueror and on delivering Pisa from its supremacy. He also began the bad fashion of carrying off works of art to ornament his own capital. In the States of the Church he occupied the fortresses and drove the Pope and Cardinals to take refuge in the castle of St. Angelo. The result of all these follies was that, although the extraordinary unpopularity of Alfonso of Aragon made the conquest of Naples as rapid as one within our own memory, it was utterly impossible to hold the country. For a league against France was secretly formed by Venice, Ferdinand, Pope Alexander VI, Maximilian, and Sforza. These powers undertook to cut Charles off from France, and if possible to take him prisoner. He, however, succeeded in making his way through the opposing forces at Fornovo, near Piacenza, leaving behind him 9,000 men to hold his conquests, but appearing afterwards to forget all about these unfortunate troops, who perished almost entirely by war and disease. The manner in which these events influenced Henry's policy was curious and characteristic. Of course, it was ordinarily the interest of an English sovereign to form no very close connections either with France or Spain, but to allow these powers to weaken themselves and each other by perpetual strife, so that neither might be able to join with Scotland in attacking him. The annexation of Bretagne had, however, caused in England a positive hatred of France, while the fact that her king was engaged in enterprises so far away made it safe to side with Spain against him. Ferdinand and Isabella, on their part, were willing to draw toward Henry in order to use him as an ally in the rear of their great enemy. In fact, the Spanish sovereigns had for some time been looking for opportunities of conciliating him, and their ambassador, Dom Pedro de Ayala, had been most influential in persuading James of Scotland to give up his support of Warbeck, thus freeing Henry from the great danger to his reign and raising the value of his friendship. 2 marriages were now planned with the object of uniting both Scotland and Spain with England, and detaching both irrevocably from the French alliance. Henry's eldest son, Arthur, was to be the husband of Catherine, the younger daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and his daughter Margaret was to become Queen of Scotland. The consequences of these 2 marriages would be wide-reaching. That with Scotland might lead to the union of the 2 countries by the succession of a Scottish prince to the English throne. If this happened, Henry acutely remarked that Scotland would still be only an accession to England, and not England to Scotland, inasmuch as the greater would necessarily draw the less. That with Spain would directly cause firmer friendship and more vigorous commercial intercourse with the Netherlands, as the Archduke Philip, Maximilian's eldest son, had married Juana, Catherine's elder sister, and this again would compel the Duchess Margaret of Burgundy to desist from any further Yorkist enterprises against Henry. Yet with all these motives to conclude Arthur's marriage at once, the negotiations for it went on slowly. An agreement was formed about its conditions in September 1496. On August 15th, 1497, the betrothal took place at Woodstock, but the marriage itself was delayed till November 1501. The same kind of caution showed itself in Henry's adhesion, September 1496, to the Italian League. He accompanied this with a stipulation that he should not, like the other members of the Confederacy, be called upon to make war with Charles. Ferdinand was willing to receive him into the League even on these terms, feeling sure that circumstances would soon compel him to take a more decided part. Meantime, the King of Aragon was preparing, as late historical discoveries have shown, a plan for overthrowing the peculiar liberties of the Gallican Church, as established by Charles VII., the grandfather of the present king. But for these it was thought no king of France would ever dare to wage war against the Pope as Charles had been doing, or to show himself so disobedient to his spiritual authority. That the marriage of Catherine should have been thus planned with the decided object of strengthening the Papacy may surely be considered as one of the most striking instances on record of the irony of fate. As having this object, it could not but be religiously dangerous to England and ominous to our liberties. Lord Bacon remarks that prosecutions for heresy were rare under Henry VII, yet they were not unknown, for Joan Boughton, Lady Young, and several other persons had been burned as Wycliffites in 1494 and the following years, and the spirit of heresy was abroad. What then was likely to be the effect of so close an alliance with Ferdinand and Isabella, who had allowed the Inquisition to burn 500 persons annually for many years together in their dominions? Here again we should feel some gratitude to the sovereign who, whether from timidity and indecision, or from something within him which did not love cruelty, did after all guard us from the worst risks which his policy was likely itself to bring on. The proposal of a crusade by Alexander VI. in 1500 on different principles from those pursued by Charles VIII. Produced a fresh indication of Henry's unwillingness to trust the Pope too far. When asked to join with Hungary, Poland, Bohemia, Venice, France, and Spain in a combined attack against the Turks, he replied with hardly concealed contempt that no prince on earth should be more forward than he to join so holy an enterprise, but that surely the Mediterranean powers, being so much nearer than he was to the scene of action, and so much better supplied with ships and galleys, ought to take the initiative in it. Yet if these should refuse, rather than his Holiness should go alone, he would wait upon him as soon as he could be ready, always provided that he might first see all differences among Christian princes fully settled, and might have some good Italian ports put into his hands for the retreat and safeguard of his men. That the envoy should be nothing at all discontented with this answer seems to show that the plan was not intended to be really serious. At the time of Catherine's betrothal, when she was only 13 years old and her bridegroom 3 years younger, the question had been raised in Spain whether she should be sent to England for education. Opinions varied on this point, some maintaining that Henry's court was morally by no means a fit place for the training of a young lady, others that as she would have to go there at last, it would be better that she should have as little remembrance as possible of any happier home. At the end of 1500 her journey was at length to take place, and hearing that her entrance into London was to be magnificent, Isabella wrote entreating Henry to curtail such expenses and give Catherine more, if possible, of his fatherly affection in lieu of them. She was to be endowed at once with the third part of the Principality of Wales, of the Dukedom of Cornwall, and of the Earldom of Chester, and in case of her becoming queen, she was to be as richly endowed as any former queen had ever been. In exchange for this somewhat hazy promise, she signed a renunciation of her dowry of 200,000 ducats. The young couple was married in the following November, and sent to reside at Ludlow Castle, from which the poor young bridegroom wrote to his father after a week or two that he had never conceived the possibility of such happiness as he was then enjoying. His occupations also seem to have been truly royal. Much of the town of Ludlow had been destroyed in the civil wars, and he encouraged its restoration by all possible means. Besides this, he devoted himself, with the help of the Welsh members of his council, to the improvement of the laws by which the Principality was governed. He is praised, too, for the peaceable disposition which made him check at once all quarrels among the members of his household. But all this genial promise was cut short by a misfortune, like that which carried off at a very early age the 2 other sons-in-law of the Catholic sovereigns. A neglected cold settled on Arthur's lungs, and he expired within 5 months of his wedding day. Before the unhappy Catherine emerged from her retirement, an ambassador came from Spain with a public commission to bring back the princess, at the same time claiming her dowry and payment of the income guaranteed to her. Yet so important did Henry's alliance appear to Ferdinand and Isabella that they gave their envoy private instructions to arrange, if possible, that the young widow should marry the Duke of York, her brother-in-law, a boy 5 years younger than herself. Of course such a marriage was irregular and would require a special dispensation from the Pope, yet considering the object proposed by the league between Ferdinand and Henry, it seemed not impossible that such a point might be conceded, especially if, as reported, Catherine had been Arthur's wife only in name. Subject to the chances of papal pliancy, the king thought it well to allow the parties to be affianced to one another. Whether the marriage actually took place or not would depend on future combinations. Meantime, the Archbishop of Canterbury's country house at Croydon was appointed for Catherine's residence, and she was treated, well or ill, according to the ebbs and flows of Henry's goodwill for Spain, holding as she did a kind of political agency for the interests of her native country. At one point Henry VII. Conceived the outrageous design of marrying her himself, but was deterred from it by Isabella's declaration that such a notion was too wicked to be so much as named in Christian ears. The conclusive reason for Ferdinand and Isabella's urgency in the affair of their daughter's second marriage must be looked for in the state of France, where Charles VIII. Had been succeeded in April 1498 by his cousin Louis of Orleans, whom we have seen revolting against him in Bretagne. The new king's first care was to bribe Pope Alexander VI. To grant a divorce from his unloved wife Jeanne of France, the daughter of Louis XI., and to secure Bretagne to the French crown by at once marrying Anne, the late king's widow. Immediately on ascending the throne he assumed the titles of King of Naples and Duke of Milan, the former as heir to Charles VIII., the latter as being descended from the Visconti of Milan. Before the year of his accession ended, he allied himself with Venice and the Pope, overran the Milanese, dethroned Ludovico Sforza, who had been restored to his dukedom after Charles VIII.'s retreat from Italy, and imprisoned him in the terrible castle of Loches near Tours. He then made with Ferdinand the strange agreement that the two powers should divide Naples between them, Apulia and Calabria being assigned to Spain, and the Terra di Lavoro and Abruzzo to France. For this purpose the French invaded the country in July 1501, took Frederick, King of Naples, prisoner, and occupied the provinces assigned to them, while Gonzalo di Cordova, Ferdinand's general, reduced Tarento and the southern districts. The natural consequences of this preposterous contract were not long in appearing. The two kings differed as to the division of the central provinces, each claiming them as belonging to his own portion. This quarrel was rising to a height at the beginning of the year 1502, so that just at the time of Arthur's death the Catholic sovereigns had the strongest motives to hold fast to the English alliance. Indeed, their ardent desire for this made them, as would appear, overlook many of the difficulties in the way of Catherine's remarriage. Henry, on his part, was not without scruples, which were strengthened by the decided opinion expressed by Warham, Bishop-elect of London, against the Pope's power to sanction it. However, Bishop Fox and other high authorities were of the contrary opinion. Indeed, considering what the Pope had already done in the way of allowing divorces, Henry might think it hard to assign any limits to his power in this direction. At any rate, the magnificent victories of Gonzalo de Cordova in Naples soon made him think no more of his doubts, and he gave full assent to the future marriage, yet by a refinement of caution made his son execute privately a formal protest against it. The latter years of Henry were once more embittered by the fear of a Yorkist insurrection. The Duke of Suffolk was a still surviving brother of Lord Lincoln, and had commanded for the king at Blackheath Field. This nobleman, having committed manslaughter in a brawl, was forced by Henry to appear personally in court, and there to sue out his pardon. Affronted at being thus treated like a common person, he fled to his aunt, the Duchess of Burgundy in Flanders. Finding little encouragement there, he made his peace with Henry and returned home. But just before Prince Arthur's marriage, for which he had incurred large debts, he once more retreated to Flanders in the hope that new discontents at home might afford him an opportunity. On this Henry resorted to his former arts. Sir Robert Curzon was instructed to go over to Flanders, pretend to join Suffolk, and gain information as to his confederates at home. This led to the arrest of the king's brother-in-law, the Earl of Devonshire, husband of Elizabeth's sister Catherine, and of Lord Abergavenny, others of meaner rank, such as Sir James Tyrrell, the murderer of the princes in the Tower, were at the same time executed. The plans of Suffolk were thus deranged, and he was reduced to live in hopeless exile, receiving, however, protection in Flanders from the Archduke Philip, who, by the death of Isabella, was now King of Castile in right of Juana, his wife. Suffolk was, however, driven from this refuge by a singular accident. In January 1506 Philip and Juana were on their way to Spain in order to take possession of their heritage. Their fleet ran down the English Channel, firing guns by way of bravado when they were near the land. But in the midst of this amusement they were surprised by a storm which shattered and dispersed their vessels, driving the sovereigns themselves into the harbour of Melcombe. No accident could possibly be more delightful to Henry, for he thus got into his power the prince who had been his most determined adversary, launching Warbeck's expedition against him, and agreeing to receive the crown of England in the event of its success. He eagerly invited Philip and Juana to visit him at Windsor, where, under cover of an honourable reception, they were to be still more completely in his power. Amid 1,000 courtesies he still held firmly to one main point. Suffolk must be surrendered. This was at last agreed to, though with extreme unwillingness, Henry on his part promising not to punish him for his rebellion, and consenting that the matter should be so arranged that the exile might seem to return of his own free will. At the same time Philip was compelled to make a new commercial treaty, which was so unpopular among his subjects that they called it the Intercursus Malis, by way of contrast with the great treaty of 1496, complaining that it sacrificed their interests by allowing English cloth to be sold in Flemish towns generally, instead of only at the two emporia of Bruges and Antwerp, and thus taking out of their hands the profits of local trade in their own country. Henry was now a widower of some years' standing, the fair and good Queen Elizabeth having died in 1501. Anxious at the thought that the succession to the throne now depended on the life of one son, he began to think of marrying again. He was not too old to hope for fresh offspring, though his weak constitution gave him an appearance of age. Several ladies were at different times proposed, and he has been deservedly ridiculed for the catalogue of inquiries which he directed to be made about the personal charms of some of them. He urgently pressed for a portrait of the widowed Queen of Naples, Isabella's niece, but met with a blank refusal. The lady would not allow her beauty to be sent about on approval. Maximilian's daughter Margaret, after being first Queen elect of France, then wife to the heir apparent of Spain, then Duchess of Savoy, seemed at one time likely to end with being Queen of England. Besides this, Henry had been more than suspected of ardently admiring Queen Juana on the Windsor visit, when the evident ill health of her husband gave a prospect of his death, which happened a few months after. All these schemes having failed, the king made a virtue of necessity, and remained for the rest of his life unmarried. A curious attempt was made in 1508 to procure from Pope Julius II, who had succeeded Alexander VI in 1503, the canonization of King Henry VI. Lord Bacon hints that the fees payable to the Roman court on such occasions were unreasonably high, amounting as they did to nearly 1,000 ducats. He inclines, however, to the view that Julius was too sensible so to honour one who was little better than a natural. That the expense would not have deterred Henry is proved by his having willingly paid similar fees for the canonization of Anselm, which took place at this time. As there were no regular parliamentary subsidies in the last 13 years of Henry's reign, he had to provide for the expenses of government otherwise, and did so by means which have stained his memory deeply. He made money out of every office in his court, received bribes for conferring bishoprics, and sold pardons to those concerned in the Cornish rebellion, the sums paid varying from £1 to £200. But far the most discreditable exactions were those which are connected with the names of Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, the former a toaster tradesman's son, employed by Henry in imitation of Louis XI's love for low-born ministers, the latter the founder, at least, of a great family, as his son John played a considerable part in English history under his successive titles of Lisle, Warwick, and Northumberland. These men enriched Henry by a course of the most odious chicane, directed against wealthy men all over England. We hear of their prosecuting Sir William Capel for being remiss in inquiring about base coin when Lord Mayor of London, and fining him £2,000. As this was the second time Sir William had been thus treated, he firmly refused to pay, and remained a prisoner in the Tower till the end of the reign. Other persons were indicted of crimes before magistrates, and then left in prison untried in defiance of Magna Carta, till they consented to pay fines or ransoms for their freedom. Sometimes, as Lord Bacon tells us, Empson and Dudley even dispensed with the help of magistrates, and committed accused persons to prison by their own authority, the pecuniary object in each case being the same. They got enormous sums for restoration in cases of technical outlawry, and even tried to establish the principle that such a composition should never be less than half a man's income for 2 years after the outlawry began. Endless vexations were also practised at times when new heirs were succeeding to landed property, by maintaining and aggravating every feudal extraction applicable to such occasions. Especially was this the case with royal wards, whose lands were given up to them only after paying extravagant fines. Empson and Dudley had also agents everywhere employed in the detestable task of hunting out defects in the title of landholders, and trying to revive obsolete rights of the crown. This practice, a return to which had in after years so much to do with the ruin of Charles I., would almost certainly have overthrown both Henry himself and his dynasty if it had been carried on long. As it was, his feeling of his approaching end made him inclined to listen to remonstrances, some of which were urged, as we are glad to hear, by the honourable boldness of the court preachers. Yet the abuses were not restrained till the king had amassed treasure to the surprising amount of £1,800,000, while his agents had laid up for themselves a store of public hatred which only waited for their master's death to discharge itself. Henry's last public act was the conclusion of a project of marriage between his daughter Mary and Charles, Prince of Castile, the son of Philip and Juana. He thus hoped that he had built round his kingdom the long-hoped-for wall of brass, since he was to have for his son-in-law the King of Scotland on the one side, and the future Lord of Spain and Burgundy on the other. When he perceived his end approaching, he proclaimed a general pardon for state offences, and also showed some desire that unjust acquisitions of the crown should be restored. Soon after this he died calmly at Richmond, April 22nd, 1509, at the age of only 52, and after a reign of 23 years and 8 months, the troubles of which had long ago brought on him infirmities far beyond his years. End of Section 6.